Welcome, everyone, to our virtual talk today, hosted by the China Institute at the University of Alberta. My name is Jia Wang. I'm the interim director of the China Institute. I'm so delighted that Professor Reza Hasmas has kindly agreed to share key findings from his highly anticipated new research project that examines the efficacy of international organizations naming and shaming China on alleged human rights violations. The University of Alberta acknowledges that we're located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. Professor Hasmas' presentation today will be followed by Q&A. We encourage our audience members to submit your questions using the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Questions can be submitted at any time, but we'll try to address them after the presentation. I'm so delighted to introduce our featured speaker today, Professor Reza Hasmas. He's a full professor at the Political Science Department at the University of Alberta, and he's also an academic advisor of the China Institute. He received his PhD from Cambridge University. A true international scholar, he has previously held faculty positions at the universities of Toronto, Melbourne, and Oxford, and has worked for think tanks, consultancies, development agencies, and NGOs in the United States, Canada, Australia, UK, and China. His award-winning research examines how the behavior of emerging Chinese state and non-state actors potentially affect salient theories, practices, and assumptions in international affairs. Without further ado, Reza, the virtual floor is yours for your presentation.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for Jia and her team for organizing this webinar. I'm just going to share my screen with you before I commence the conversation we're going to have today on naming and shaming China on human rights. So just bear with me while I just move these icons around. Brilliant. So this is a really interesting project that I've literally finished writing up a few hours ago, to be very frank. It's something that's been 2 decades in the making. A lot of the work I've been doing, since the early 2000s is looking at how social organizations operate in China. I've also looked at very sensitive issues on China, looking at ethnicity and rights and the sort of understanding of how China operates itself in terms of human rights framework. And over the years, I've often tried to imagine and try to analyze and examine whether or not international pressure on China actually works. And so in this particular paper, in this particular study in general, I'm trying to understand, does naming and shaming as a tactic actually change or shifts China's human rights sort of work? And so I'm going to detail it to you in a much more academic fashion. And I'll give you some data, I'll illustrate some regressions, then I'll try to talk about the implications and then talk about strategies China could potentially take to combat the naming and shaming. And then perhaps we can open up to the floor to see any questions you may have. So let me start off by suggesting this. Naming and shaming is a popular strategy employed by human rights organizations to improve the human rights conditions in a target nation. So naming and shaming, it's really been theorized as a rhetorical coercion, so to speak. It's employing sort of rhetoric to affect change through global shame, rather than hard forms of coercion or persuasion, such as, for example, military intervention or economic sanctions, which has been quite in vogue over the last couple of months. In most jurisdictions, naming and shaming has not been very effective overall. In fact, if you look at studies in Latin America, naming and shaming was only found to be most effective in targeted nations which had a high dependency on foreign aid. And that's not necessarily the reality we see in the Chinese context. There's very little work out there that actually examines whether or not naming and shaming actually can be used as an effective strategy in the Chinese context. The assumption has been is that, well, it has worked in other jurisdictions, but where it has worked is when, as I suggested from other studies, it's where there's a high dependency on foreign aid. So it's coupled with other strategies beyond naming and shaming. Um, and in fact, if you want to look at the prevailing sort of literature out there, it suggests that naming and shaming from NGOs and religious organizations have the strongest effect, while international governmental organizations such as the UN Human Rights Council had the weakest effect. And in fact, the effects of naming and shaming was most strong when it came from multiple sources. So this is sort of the background sort of work in terms of trying to understand, does naming and shaming China on human rights work? So I'll give you a few words about the methodological strategy. Basically, I collected all the publicly available human rights reports pertaining to China from 3 different human rights-based organizations between 1991 and 2021. So we have a 30-year kind of sample there. The 3 organizations were Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Office of United Nations Human Rights Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as their sort of interrelated sort of organization within the UN system, the UN Human Rights Council. Amnesty International has been quite active on campuses, so many of you might be aware of them, whereby they're an international NGO headquartered in London, UK. Its stated mission goal is to, quote, ensure every person enjoys all the human rights enshrined in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and other human rights instruments. It aims to accomplish this by undertaking research and action focused on preventing and ending grave abuses of these rights. Then we have Human Rights Watch, which is a New York City-based organization, which, quote, uses traditional on-the-ground fact-finding with new technologies and innovative advocacy to do research and advocacy on economic, social, cultural, political, and civil human rights. Finally, we have the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the UN Human Rights Council, which is a leading intergovernmental agency which looks at the full range of human rights and freedoms set out in the 1948 UN Declaration on Human Rights. And as an organization, they aim to promote, protect, empower, and assist governments in injecting human rights sort of perspective into all UN programs. So effectively, I took all the publicly available sort of documents pertaining to China from these organizations and collected it into a sort of a database to analyze the sort of strategies that's used. Now, there's, if you get into greater depth in terms of how Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and the UN system actually utilize naming and shaming strategies, well, there's some slight variations. So Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch generally uses press releases intended for the media and the general public's consumption. They might have more detailed background reports based on more in-depth human rights investigations. Amnesty International in particular also pursues urgent action campaigns, and they generally get their members to write letters to an offending government. In the United Nations Human Rights Council, the process for naming and shaming, it's much more process-driven. It has 4 possible outcomes. So first, if there's an alleged abuse, the target nation's abuses are discussed in the private session and does not continue. There might be confidential considerations may continue. There might be a mild sanction is issued, such as a critical statement with limited publication, or they pass a public resolution condemning the abuses. So this gives you sort of a background behind the sort of the internal strategies that Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations HRC does when it comes to naming and shaming strategies. So as I said, I collected all the available information that's publicly accessible over the last 30 years from 1991 to 2021. And here we can see the total number of human rights reports on China per annum during this time period. What's really interesting when you look at this chart is from 2008 onwards, we see an increase in terms of the human rights reports. And if we look at 2013 in particular, well, rather 2008 is when China hosted the International Olympic Committee's Summer Games. So there was greater attention on China. But by 2012, 2013, we see Xi Jinping increasing, actually getting power. So the new sort of regime at this stage. So under the Xi Jinping era, there's been more human rights reports by these three agencies than ever beforehand since in the 20th and 21st century. So it's really interesting to see that these reports are increasing in scale and scope. And in fact, what we see here is the total combined reports from the three organizations spanning 1991 and 2021. If you really want to get really specific, Human Rights Watch and the United Nations Human Rights Watch was 1991 to 2020. The United Nations system was 2013 to 2020. Those were where we saw an abundance of these sort of reports on China's human rights, alleged human rights abuses. Now, what's really fascinating is this aggregating these kinds of reports by not only theme, but also by affected persons. So here we can see the general themes that are conducive to these reports that's being issued by these three organizations. Generally speaking, they are rights-based kinds of reports, that is political and civil rights-based kinds of alleged abuses. We see that there is discrimination. We see that there's economic discrimination. We see that generally seems to be the major kinds of reports on an annual basis, by a thematic basis, that is. I should mention that these themes are self-reported. And so it's actually coded by the United Nations, these particular themes. And what we ended up doing is just coding it in terms of the Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch sort of themes as well, into the UN sort of themes. So we can really see distinctive themes, particularly in the 2010s, as I mentioned. Now, there's also by affected persons. What we see is that activists are being targeted more in terms of human rights reports. We see that there's political sort of persecution, perhaps. We see that the least reports are generally looking at children. It's not there as much. Drug use is not so much. We see, for example, here that vulnerable individuals are increasing in scale and scope, ethnic minorities, particularly among Xinjiang. So we can really see how the nature of China's human rights, sort of alleged human rights reports, has shifted and been in the 2010s based on this data here. Now, this is not necessarily, the purpose is really to try to understand, is putting pressure on China working? So on the one hand, I've collected all the data, looking at Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the United Nations, looking at the type of reports on alleged human rights abuses, looking at the affected persons. And what we can see here is that all three human rights organizations have maintained a concerted effort to both name China's alleged human rights violations and also to shame them internationally through awareness campaigns and aimed at highlighting these alleged abuses. So what these naming and shaming efforts really do is that they put pressure, at least in theory, on China in a myriad of uncountable ways. So, for example, it can be through potential loss of international investment. It can be through negative media coverage. It can be further garnering of negative international reputation concerning human rights. So, for example, when we're looking at the alleged abuses in Xinjiang, there's been a lot of international investment that China's lost by virtue of these alleged abuses in the Xinjiang area. So, how to examine whether or not this is effective? To test the effect, really, of the reports on human rights in China. So we've collected the reports. I've given you the disaggregation of those reports. The next way to actually test to see if there's any causal relationship, I used Our World in Data sort of project data. This is an Oxford University's data set. And what they have here is that they have 6 major indices looking at human rights score, economic freedom, political competition, human rights violations, democracy participation and competition, and freedom of press. So effectively what I'm trying to do here is test those indices and that sort of data set that they have there on the basis of the sort of reports to see if there's any demonstrable sort of shifts in China's behavior. So amongst the indices tested, human rights score was statistically significant, which is great news because it tells us we have a sort of a score that we can utilize to try and understand whether or not these reports actually play a role to some extent in changing China's human rights score. Just for academic reasons, the economic freedom score was not statistically significant. Human rights violations, democracy participation, competition, and freedom of press did not have enough pre or post-treatment data. Political competition did not have much diverse data to afford meaningful causal analysis. But again, as I suggested to you, the human rights score was statistically significant, which makes it a great sort of comparator to try and understand how these reports actually might play a role in testing the human rights score. So I'm going to give you a series of charts. I'm going to give you a series of regressions. If you're not statistically inclined, not to worry. I'll after I go through a few of these charts, I will try to explain to you the implications and what they really mean. So the first chart I'm going to look at is the causal effect of organizations' reports on China's human rights score. Effectively, what this chart is suggesting is that the United Nations on their reports have a greater causal effect on China's human rights score. And you can see that it's a gross variation compared to Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. So what this suggests here is that the United Nations, followed by Human Rights Watch, and followed by the combined element, or rather, sorry, the United Nations, then combined and Human Rights Watch, all play a statistically significant sort of role in terms of changing the perception. But as you can see, the gross majority of the United Nations work does play a role in affecting China's human rights score. And I'm going to explain why that's the case as we continue this presentation. Amnesty International was not statistically significant, so that was something that had to be dealt with, and I'll discuss that a bit more in a moment. In fact, let me show you the Amnesty International effect on China's human rights score. So although Amnesty International appears to have caused a positive effect, this effect is not statistically significant, as I mentioned, when considering the entire post-intervention period as a whole. So individual days or shorter stretches within the intervening period may, of course, still have a significant effect whenever the lower limit of the impact time series was above zero. This apparent effect could be the result of random fluctuations that are unrelated to the intervention. This is often the case when the intervention period is very long and includes much of the time when the effect is already worn off. And so, what we see here is that Amnesty International may not have had a major effect that's statistically significant. So that's effectively what this graph is illustrating here. When we look at Human Rights Watch, we see that the individual data points during the post-intervention period, the response variable had an overall value of 51.67. By contrast, if the intervention did not take place, we would expect a sum of 43.35. In other words, that's a fancy way of suggesting to you that Human Rights Watch had about a 19-20%, sorry, the exact figure was 19% sort of effect on China's human rights score. And then if we go to the United Nations, we see here the best effect is from the UN system, where there is a approximate 124% change. That's a significant change here on China's human rights score. And finally, the combined effect here, we see that the response variable had an overall value of 54.28. By contrast, if there was no intervention among all three parties, that is Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations, we would expect a score of 44.70. So, in relative terms, the response variable showed an increase of 21%. Now, again, if you're not statistically inclined, this may be seen as fancy charts, but it doesn't tell you much. There's a few takeaways here. This is what I can suggest to you. There's a few takeaways we can have from all of this. Foremost, treatment for the United Nations is the most successful. That's the first takeaway from the data. And why that's important is as follows. When we look at human rights in China, or rather when we look at human rights in general, we often forget that there's actually two different discourses on human rights that's predominant. It's been predominant in the latter part of the 20th century and in the early 21st century. That is, there's an International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and there's an International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The United Nations, as an organization, does practice both economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as civil and political rights. So it may suggest one of the reasons why the United Nations has been most successful in actually influencing China's human rights record. But we can dig a bit deeper into that as well. China has been successful as well at avoiding being condemned by the United Nations Human Rights Council's public resolutions because it is a member of the United Nations Human Rights Council. And it's also proposed alternative models of human rights, less focus on civil and political rights and more so on economic, social, and cultural rights, where it's a party to the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and it's not a party to the Civil and Political Convention. So put differently, what we do find is that China does try to promote conceptualizing human rights in local contexts. Which many critics have argued that it weakens human rights, or at least civil and political rights, and the UNHRC's sort of work. Now, so the UN has been the most successful based on the data. The combined effect on all treatments is the next successful. That's just another way of suggesting when you combine Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations, when you find that all three organizations true pressure China, that's the second most successful. The third most successful is Human Rights Watch, and the least successful is Amnesty International. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, they do rely a lot on local NGOs' presence to be more, that leads to more campaigning and to more engagement. For those of you who might be aware of the Chinese context, international NGOs, particularly rights-based NGOs, have a very difficult time operating in China at this stage. Both Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have a difficult time relying on local human rights organizations who they partner with, or even having a presence in the mainland. So, and this can potentially contribute to the fact why those two organizations are not as successful. It's simply because of, one, they are more civil and political rights based rather than economic, social, and cultural rights. And two, because they don't have much of a local presence as they do in other jurisdictions, which makes them more effective. Now, there is some methodological concerns. One of that being is that the human rights score is not without controversy in terms of its methodology. It is possible that China's human rights score shifted during the treatment period, which has no which has no connection to human rights reports. So maybe economic development, local resistance, a rising middle class, or international investment. So they can all play a role, but statistically speaking, the data does show that there is a good correlation between the United Nations and combined treatments and Human Rights Watch in particular as statistically significant to the human rights score. Now, the last thing I want to mention is looking at potential countering strategies by China. And the reason why I do this is that it allows us to understand what strategies China might use to combat potential human rights allegations. And if you're thinking even further ahead, strategies that international organizations can do in retort to counteract their counter strategies, so to speak. So there are rhetorical methods a targeted state can use to deny, deflect, or otherwise counter naming and shaming allegations on the international stage. There is, for instance, the reverse rhetorical entrapment response to naming and shaming. And we saw this being done in the United States response to Human Rights Watch's shaming of torture interrogation methods post 9/11. And what you saw is that the US administration at the time responded with a framing that its methods were justified to battle the war on terror. And we see China has used this sort of reverse rhetorical entrapment response when it comes to Xinjiang, whereby it's tried to link the rise of ethnic tensions in the region to potential terrorism. So it was a playbook that was used by the United States, in fact, post 9/11. And we can utilize this as a reverse rhetorical entrapment response. So in many respects, it is something that you're using a consequentialist argument about whether or not methods can be effective and not simply whether the torture was a human rights violation effectively. So we have to be mindful that China is utilizing a response such as this. Another rhetorical method can be the implication contest. And in the case of Human Rights Watch, for example, they were naming and shaming the Israeli Defense Force during the Lebanon War and the Gaza War. And when accused of violating international humanitarian law, the Israeli Defense Force did not argue against the credibility or applicability of international humanitarian law, but rather utilized abstract vagaries to argue that its tactics were not excessive according to international humanitarian law. And in turn, Human Rights Watch was counter-shamed by the Israeli Defense Force. And they actually employed IDF NGOs such as NGO Monitor to their assistance. So, this is something that if China is named and shamed in this respect, they can do an implication contest kind of strategy. There's some other strategies that China can use to counter some of the naming and shaming out there. So for instance, the naming and shaming of political rights abuses tends to lead targeted states to substitute the name abuses for other more violent abuses. So this is what's called a repression substitution hypothesis. So I'll give you an example. If there was killing, if there was a capital punishment, for example, when shamed for imprisonment or torture, while the less violent imprisonment and disappearance were also significant substitutes for torture. In other words, what we do find is that when you name and shame political rights abuses, it can actually lead to other abuses, much more violent abuses. And the evidence see that from other jurisdictions that we do see this as a reality. So it is possible that China may stop its abuses on X, but actually do something much more harmful in Y as a substitution. Finally, another technique that China can utilize, it can avoid the adverse consequences of being shamed by simply pursuing new international relationships with like-minded nation states. So that way it's not being named and shamed. The effects of the naming and shaming can actually be contained by virtue of having greater alliances and greater sorts of allegiances to other like-minded nation states, whether there'll be Russia, for example, which has made the headlines today. This is something that China can do to potentially counteract the naming and shaming strategies that international organizations utilized. So at the end of the day, the takeaway from this talk is this. When it comes to naming and shaming in China, generally speaking, economic, social, and cultural rights as a human right tends to have the best outcomes. And so that's why we see the United Nations as an entity has the best possible outcomes, whereby if you're naming and shaming China in terms of civil and political rights, generally speaking, there's not as much influence that global actors have in terms of their influence on China in this respect. Finally, there are issues in China that are more susceptible to naming and shaming because it's a low cost to the regime. For example, if you name and shame China in terms of the environment, they are more statistically likely to be responsive to that because it's seen as a much more safer sort of topic area than, say, civil and political rights oriented sort of naming and shaming tactics. So that's the sort of the key takeaways that the study illustrates. And I've done it both through statistical data, as I've illustrated, but also through understanding the sort of strategies that other nations have utilized to counteract naming and shaming strategies. So let me end the presentation there, and I think we can stop sharing and see if there are any questions or comments I can potentially answer.
Well, thank you, Reza, very much for that fascinating presentation. And there's so much information there. There's a lot of empirical data and evidence that you and your team collected and to present this case. So there are a couple questions and some from the audience members. One is about sort of the methodology, just basically the person submitted a question, wonders how the impacts of these or effectiveness of these groups, three human rights organizations that you were looking at, how the impacts are measured. We see the charts and really so how do you distinguish the impacts from these three different organizations, pre, post? Maybe just wondering about the methodology here. If you could maybe elaborate a little further on that.
Sure. So that's a great question. The first step, as I mentioned, is you do need to look at the human rights. We're looking at the impact of the reports on their human rights score. So the human rights score is from our world, our world data, and effectively, what's being done there is trying to compare the human rights score and the shifts in the human rights score over 1991 to 2021 relative to the naming and shaming strategy. So you're just statistically comparing that. There's statistical significance in doing that. So that's where the quantitative data analysis was trying to show you in those charts, that there is statistical significance. The only statistical significance, lack of significance, was with Amnesty International. So for Human Rights Watch, for the United Nations, there was statistically significance in terms of the relationship between the reports and the human rights score. So once we have that as a statistical sort of proven sort of methodology there, we're then comparing the shifts over a temporal period over time. And so that's how we start seeing whether or not there is a sort of relationship from a temporal standpoint between the reports and the human rights score as reported by this data set there. So that's a very easy way to illustrate that sort of relationship.
Great, thank you. Reza, another question is, does naming and shaming the government and say politicians instead more effective than naming and shaming the country itself?
So this is a tough question because the strategies that you use in China may not be the strategy used in other jurisdictions. There are hidden strategies for success in China. Publicly naming and shaming China, whether the nation or the government, it's a big no-no if you want to be effective internally within China. You can name and shame them internally, of course, without the public sort of discourse being illustrated about this naming and shaming. You can criticize China in private, and that it's been proven, at least in terms of the hidden strategies for success, is that sort of naming and shaming has been proven much more successful in affording change in the greater context of China. Publicly, of course, there are certain key issues you can name and shame China that's much more effective than, say, other issues. So those issues such as the environment, as I mentioned, economic and social and cultural rights perhaps has greater feasibility in naming and shaming China than, say, civil and political rights. So this is a long-winded way of saying two things. One, naming and shaming directly the politicians and the country is probably not the best course of action if you want to look at the internal strategies for success. You need to do so within the structures of China to actually name and shame within that sort of structure. The second thing to suggest is this idea that there's certain key issues that are much less sensitive, and you can name and shame China publicly, and the environment is perhaps the best one. Whereas if you're looking at labor rights, if you're looking at civil rights and political rights, naming and shaming China may not have the attendant shifts domestically within China anyways.
Thank you, Reza here, and maybe another question. So does naming and shaming from, say heads of states, some of the powerful nations like the United States, really influence how China think or behave?
Not at all. I'm sorry to be so blunt about it, but in other studies that I've done, is trying to understand, how do you influence policymakers? How do you influence think tanks? How do you influence decision makers? And we see external sort of pressures, particularly on civil and political rights, generally has very little sway within the internal dialogue of China. In fact, it has very minimal. And so it begs the question, why would Western jurisdictions try to name and shame China? Well, you have to think about which audience you're speaking to. So if you're looking at the Canadian or the American or the British or Australian context, if they're naming and shaming China, they're speaking to their own audiences and saying that, hey, we're standing up for fundamental rights that we believe in. Whether or not that has an influence in China internally is very moot, because it does not have a very strong influence internally. That's not to say that policymakers and think tanks can't be influenced, but that's not the way you influence them. You influence them through their internal structures. That's the way you would influence their sort of policymaking thought and policymaking decision-making, not through a public naming and shaming exercise.
Another question is shaming and naming more effective one is directed towards a specific case or specific issue, like political prisoners? And basically, are they more effective when it's targeted rather than a sort of overarching strategy?
So let's be clear, when it comes to civil and political rights, naming and shaming is not a strategy that works in itself. It has to be coupled with other strategies, other pressures, and even then, the effects are very minimal. And so we're looking at this in aggregate. When it comes to economic, social, and cultural rights, when it comes to the environment, you're more likely to be able to use naming and shaming as a strategy in itself to afford change or to afford some influence in China. And so, it is disaggregated by issue. It is disaggregated in terms of the effects of naming and shaming based on the particular type of rights you're looking at. And again, as I mentioned, civil and political rights is probably the least effective of naming and shaming, whereas economic, social, and cultural rights are the most effective. And that's why we see the United Nations, and particularly the UNHCR, has the greatest sort of influence on China, because they are naming and shaming China on the economic, social, and cultural rights for the most part.
Great, thank you. Another question here is whether you think the UN is more successful is because they can actually take actions, as opposed to Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch. Would they be just because an organization can take more action, so it becomes more effective?
So that's a really good intuitive sort of question. And I can understand the intuition that the United Nations might have a greater ability to influence a nation, but it's actually quite the opposite. In fact, because China is on the UNHCR, they're on their council rather, you find that there isn't as much influence that other countries have, because China does influence the council in many respects. So again, you got to disaggregate it by issue. The UNHCR has increased its sort of influence on China because it is focusing on rights, and a rights-based understanding that attunes to China in many respects, the economic, social, and cultural rights. Whereas Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, or Amnesty International in particular, is more civil and political rights-based oriented, whereas HRW is more civil and political rights, but it also has economic, social, and cultural rights. So that might explain why Human Rights Watch has a slightly higher advantage in influencing China than Amnesty International, just because of the issues it's examining and trying to influence China on.
Thank you, Reza. And this interesting question is, from a Chinese perspective, would naming and shaming China be portrayed within China as a tool for the Western countries to sanction China and to isolate China, and that potentially is, serving the ruling party of China to kind of rally support among its population.
So that assumes that the naming and shaming is being known by the general public in China. For the most part, the naming and shaming strategies and tactics utilized are not widely known or infiltrated within the general public in China, where you're going to instigate a sort of a response by the general public that this is Western nations trying to impose its will onto China. So we can't even take it that far. It's not well known. And again, it goes back to this idea, if you want to influence China, you do not influence China by publicly shaming it. It just does not work within the domestic sort of hidden rules for success. That's like the worst thing you can do to try to influence China, is trying to publicly shame and name and shame it. What you can do to influence China is to work within its sort of domestic apparatus, to work with its policy entrepreneurs, work with its think tanks, to work with those kinds of organizations to change the discourse. So maybe, in NGO studies, we talk about a cultural change thesis, changing the culture from within. To make it more acceptable that this is a stance that a nation should take, and that takes time. And so there's no a naming and shaming strategy is seen as a very quick strategy relative to a cultural change thesis, whereby you are working within the structures of the nation to actually shift their sort of internal thinking from policy inception to policy execution. And so the hidden rules for success is in conflict with a naming and shaming strategy, generally speaking.
Mm-hmm. So there's another question about methodology. I think there's a lot of audience members here are fascinated by the way you conducted this research. So this audience member asked if I get it right, you run a regression of the HR index over time, over the variables, collecting the reports of the three institutions over time. The question is how you control for the state of the socioeconomic growth over the same years.
Right, that's a great question. In fact, when we look at studies that look at the impact on naming and shaming, that's one of the methodological sort of issues that you just have to bear with, is the fact that you can't control for the fact that perhaps China's economic growth might lead to different value shifts. It is almost near impossible to do that. You can't do that. There's techniques to do that, but even then there are holes to those techniques. So it is a given that it's a methodological restriction insofar that you can't control for the growth of expectations based on economic growth. There might be different variances as well subnationally. Maybe naming and shaming might work in Beijing, a tier 1 city like Beijing, versus say a tier 3 or tier 4 city, or tier 3 or tier 4 jurisdiction. So there's subnational variations as well. If you want to go deeper into this, there are multiple ways in which there's some methodological issues, but it is a sort of standard that we've used in the literature to examine naming and shaming as a strategy, just accepting the fact that there are some difficulties. There's some other factors that need to potentially utilize to understand there might be a relationship here. So yeah, that is a great point.
Thank you, Reza. Here's another question about how impactful it is if naming and shaming China when it's done or comes from international or Chinese celebrities and movie stars, sports stars, rather than an international organization.
So I guess positionality matters. So the study does not look at domestic naming and shaming. In fact, to be very frank, there are very few instances of domestic naming and shaming that has been successful on a mass sense. Because again, as I've said beforehand, it's not the hidden rules for success in the Chinese context to afford change, is to publicly name and shame the government. That's the worst thing you can do. There are issues such as the environment. where that can be a possibility. So we can see many domestic NGOs in China have actually named and shamed local governments, and they've been very successful in affording change. But again, it's very rare that you see that the environment is a less sensitive issue than, say, civil and political rights, or if we're looking at labor rights or legal rights. It's seen as very sensitive issues that a naming and shaming strategy by domestic parties may not yield very productive results.
There's another question from the audience member. As a community, what is the best strategy really to influence human rights behavior in China? Befriend, work with China, or speak out against it, or maybe a mixture of both?
So it depends on your sort of domestic preferences. So what I mean by that is this: naming and shaming. If the Canadian government names and shames China, generally speaking, it's not as effective. What it does signal to the Canadian audience is that Canada cares about its dear values, and these are our dear values and beliefs that we subscribe to, and it's our role to suggest to China that this is what we subscribe to, and we believe that they're violating perhaps certain human rights that we hold dear. Domestically, on the other hand, again, the strategy is very different. I would suggest a threefold strategy. One strategy would be to actually try to have networks with the policy entrepreneurs in the Chinese context. Chinese entrepreneurs can influence domestically the policymaking process. In other studies that I've done, I've illustrated how that actually plays a role. The entrepreneurial sort of class, the policy entrepreneurial class actually influences a sort of policy thought on rights. And so that takes time to actually infiltrate and to actually influence the Chinese context. So the policy entrepreneurs, this also includes the think tanks. So think tanks and the sort of internal think tanks play a role. The second thing is long-term engagement with China in a meaningful way. You find that we often do the opposite. We tend to disengage when we believe China or any other nation is not subscribing to the rights and norms that we hold dear. Rather, I would suggest we need to engage even more so. Over time, when there's engagement between both sides, the norms and values on both sides actually transfer. It's a bi-directional transfer. It's not only one unidirectional. So China may influence us as us influencing China. The third one is, it's kind of counterintuitive, but it's been proven to be very successful. So for example, in Xinjiang right now, many Western companies are actually leaving Xinjiang, or have left Xinjiang. And in fact, I would suggest to you that while the optics are great in doing that, and the general public might demand this, international general public, that is, might demand this, it's counterintuitive, because by removing oneself from the Chinese, from Xinjiang, you're not actually improving labor standards. You're not improving rights within the society at large. The more there's Western presence in a place in China, in terms of companies being there, you find that over time, norms and values start getting shifted there, and over time, we see rights being, changing in a way that we see as positive. So at the end of the day, a naming and shaming strategy is very short-term. It's a short-term approach to try and get a country, to induce a country to shift. It works best when there are other levers. So it's not a coincidental that in nations where there is a strong foreign debt, where there's foreign debt and there's foreign obligations from an economic standpoint towards that nation, coupled with naming and shaming, you tend to see greater changes in that particular nation. That's not the case for China. And so there are not other levers insofar as other jurisdictions are concerned that we can use in combination with naming and shaming in the Chinese context. So we need to take a long-term strategy when it comes to trying to improve political and civil rights in the Chinese context. It has to be a strategy that works within the administrative structure of China, and realizing we need to have more engagement with China rather than less engagement with China when it comes to norms transfers. And again, the caveat to that is norms transfers are not only monodirectional, it is bidirectional. So their norms and their values would also get transfused into Canadian society as well as ours onto Chinese society. So that's a sort of a long-term strategy that one has to undertake to work within the hidden rules for success in the Chinese context.
Yeah, that's a lot of information and a good suggestion there, Reza. So in the past, of course, before COVID, before perhaps China's relationship with the West is getting at this fraught state, I recall that there are these exercises where Canadians and other Western observers or experts are invited to even to China to some perhaps closed door meetings or conferences to discuss human rights issues and even having a dialogue on those issues. But I was informed by practitioners in this field that often what works well is to target or focus on specific issues and to negotiate or speak with Chinese participants to try to identify solutions or improvement in a specific area rather than maybe speaking publicly and making those grand stands. But I don't know if this type of tactic you think will yield further success, especially when China and the West seems to be drifting further apart. There seems to be ideological divide, and the West is trying to maybe work more closely with like-minded allies to counter China. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that kind of strategy.
That's really a loaded question. Let me see if I can disaggregate it a bit more. So I think you're right. During the COVID period, there's been less engagement between China and the Western states. If you're talking in the Canadian context, we've had the least amount of engagement in my memory anyways with the Chinese. And that's a negative because you need to have that meaningful engagement to generate trust amongst each other. Those people-to-people exchanges, as China would say, is necessary. Those conferences, those dialogues, those private dialogues is necessary not only to exchange ideas, but to generate minimum levels of trust amongst each other, to have frank conversations in the private about rights and human rights, whether it's civil and political rights or economic, social, and cultural rights. And we're not doing that as much. So it's not that there's an ideological divide. The ideological divide has always been there. Rather, what's different now is that we tend not to actually engage with each other at a minimum level where we can trust each other to have a conversation where we can discuss these issues. Now, in terms of targeting specific issues, again, that is super important that we do that. And that's something that we need to continue to do so. And I'll give you a great example of this. Xinjiang is something I've been looking at for 2 decades now. I did my PhD work there. I've studied this, for the last couple of decades, as I said. And what I find is that we don't seem to have frank conversations on both ends about human rights abuses in Xinjiang, for example. It's perceived on the Chinese side as though we're preaching to China how China should operate in that area. And on the Chinese side, there's no understanding that, hey, we as Western nations have gone through some of these issues as well. We forget that we don't exactly have a great past when it comes to, for example, indigenous communities. And we had some of the mistakes that China might potentially be making right now. So to have that trust, at minimum levels of trust, to have these frank conversations in private is super important. And it's not occurring right now. So the lessons learned from both ends, it's not being transferred. In other words, we have all these great information and great solutions to problems that China's facing and perhaps problems that Canada's facing, but it's being trapped because we're not having those frank conversations, those people-to-people exchanges at the policy level or at the ministerial level or at the diplomatic level. We're not having it to that same extent anymore. We're talking at each other than with each other. So I think that's a grave mistake. That is something that would only, illustrate a greater sort of ideological divide that has always been there, to be very frank. But as I said, what's different now is that we're not having those people-to-people conversations that's necessary to try to improve rights-based conversations on both ends.
Yeah, very much indeed. I think not just on the human rights issue, but there are a range of other issues that the two, I say Canada and China, are not really engage in some of the high level or even mid level conversations that used to be there. The mechanism's still there, but it just hasn't been utilized very much. And I suspect that might have been also the case between China and some other nations in the Western world. And that really creates a problem when the two sides can't even just sit down and have a calm talk about some of these issues. Of course, two sides won't see eye to eye on many of them, but not to engage, not to even discuss, can be problematic. And Reza, are you, I know we neither of us have a crystal ball, but looking into the future, are you still somewhat optimistic there will be areas where in human rights where other countries can work with China to improve and influence, or you think we're not at a very productive stage right now, and that may be the case for the maybe at least the medium term?
So I am optimistic that rights would improve in the Chinese context, particularly civil and political rights. And it's not because of international influences. It's actually domestically, I think there's intergenerational value shifts amongst Chinese citizens. I mean, this is a lot to do with modernization theory, if you want to get the academic lingo on this. But as one gets wealthier, one's values might shift. And I'll give you a great axiom to reinforce this. I remember, and I have some students attending today, and you've probably heard me say this many times. One of the things I learned in one of the early days of my field work for my PhD many years ago, I remember speaking to taxi drivers who are a great sort of bastion to understand the local culture. And, somehow we got talking about rights because they say, hey, you're a political scientist. You're like, oh, we need to talk about certain things. And his question was very simple. He was suggesting to me that, why do we talk about civil and political rights when I'm just trying to eat? I mean, if I don't, and his exact words was, I don't care about free speech if I'm hungry every day. So economic and social rights matters more to me right now than civil and political rights. In other words, if I was to put a academic spin on that, is this idea that your basic things that the nation needs first and foremost before it can think of other luxuries, quote unquote, such as the right to free speech. If I can't eat, what's the point of having free speech? In other words, he would suggest. And so as the country's incomes increases, the theory has often been that, rights, different ordering of rights becomes more important. So I think it's not necessarily international pressure that might influence China. It might be from within, internally. You find that there might be a greater attunement to more civil and political rights as there's this intergenerational shift. And the CPC is quite acutely aware of that. And I think their task at hand from an internal standpoint is to ensure that this shift happens gradually and not dramatically, because they've seen what happens when the shift happens very dramatically. You can have regime change, and that's what's happened in former communist nations and former socialist nations. And so they are aware of this shifting that's occurring, and it takes time. It might be a few decades until we see a greater sort of shift towards civil and political rights than economic and social and cultural rights.
Okay, with that, thank you so much, Reza, for that fascinating presentation and also the discussion today. And I think this is an important topic, and we will continue to follow up on new development and maybe new research coming from you and your team. I know you've been observing this issue and some of the also the minorities treatment in China for a long time. So these are highly topical issues, and we're hoping to continue to work with you and perhaps to also have another chance to hear your future research on these topics. Thank you so much, Reza, for giving us this fascinating talk today. And thank you all the audience members for being here and for your active participation. A lot of great questions. Just a quick note about an upcoming event on April the 20th. We're working with the Institute of China-American Studies to organize a panel discussion on the middle power countries' perceptions on the US-China relations. Please stay tuned. Please visit our website for more details. And that's a wrap. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. Please enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Reza.